Audi Q3. The 1.4 engine of the EA211 series under the hood of the Audi Q3 is not often seen. Firstly, it's rather weak for a premium car, and secondly, it only works with front-wheel drive versions of the model, and a crossover without 4WD, like cereal without milk, is a waste of money. Nevertheless, in the EA211 gasoline line, it is both more economical and more reliable, even despite its childhood illnesses. It doesn't matter what kind of 1.4 TFSI your Q3 has, a pre-styling 140 horsepower or a modified version with 150 horsepower. And a system for shutting down half of the cylinders, you will have to put up with the oil burner. Adding a liter of grease every 10,000 kilometers is standard practice. Where does this oil go? First into the combustion chamber through the ring seals and then into the pipe. Therefore, an increased tendency to carbon formation forces periodic decocking of the piston, otherwise the risk of detonation, ring sticking, and the infamous breakage of piston baffles increases. It is rare that anyone is engaged in such prevention, so buying a Q3 for 1.4 TFSI with a mileage of more than 150 TkM is more like a gamble. Here's how lucky. The second weak point of the EA211 is turbocharging, or rather the actuator drive, which is famous in certain circles. It needs to be cleaned and lubricated sometimes, or just wait until the first errors appear in the ECU for overblowing or underblowing. Then the size of the investment will depend on only two things: whether the plastic drive broke or not, whether the unit body burst or remained intact. In the worst case scenario, you will have to change the entire snail for a six-figure sum. Otherwise, 1.4 behaves docilely, being noted only by common VAG sores in the form of chronic pump leaks on early runs and the chirping of the injection pump pusher. With proper care, the engine can safely roll back 250 to 300 TkM, but few people bother with preventive work from the ones already listed. Rarely does anyone change the oil twice as often as the deadly regulations, so in most cases the engine is only enough for 200 to 250 TkM. Let's be honest, the 2.0 engine of the EA888 series, due to its unpredictability, is simply terrible in terms of choosing a used car, especially when it comes to pre-styling versions EA888 2 generations. But there are most of these modifications on sale. The first thing that ate the brain of motorists is the oil separator. Its delicate membrane is torn even up to 50 TkM, disrupting the circulation of crankcase gases and increasing the mass loser already characteristic of these motors to the size of obscenity. Fortunately, there is a cardinal solution replacing the part with an original modernized one. Thanks, of course, to the caring Germans, but then it gets worse. The second stumbling block was the timing chain. Calling it eternal language will not turn around, because the average service life was approximately 80,000 kilometers, although there are cases of critical wear with a sudden jump by one tooth and 60,000. The worst thing is that the stretch chain runs almost silently, and the only objective assessment of its resource is to check the remaining stroke of the tensioner rod every 20 TkM. Computer diagnostics displays only the degree of deviation from the initial value of the camshaft position, so the readings of VAG diagnostician are only an indirect characteristic. You can also change the chain to a reinforced VAG1, taking one set of guides and, of course, a tensioner, which also played a role in this tragic performance called chain on EA888. As in the case of the 1.4, the 2-liter beast also passes oil through the piston rings and is also covered from the inside with solid deposits, leading to anything but 500,000 kilometers without a capital. And that's not it. We have not even finished with the breakdowns of the timing mechanism. It's time to talk about the camshaft bearings, which, due to design miscalculations, do not receive the proper amount of lubrication, and at some point their surfaces become covered with scuffs. And these are extraneous knocks and failures in the operation of the phase regulators. This problem occurs less frequently, but systematically, and costs a decent amount. The plastic intake manifold sometimes bursts at the seams, violating the composition of the mixture. Cracks usually grow along the axis of the damper for changing the length of the intake, so such a defect cannot be repaired, only a replacement assembly. The high-pressure fuel pump usually annoys only a harmless chirping, but sometimes you have to change either the pusher or the entire pump assembly, especially when gasoline starts to get into the oil because of it. And, of course, the oiler. Where without him? The first versions of Q3 with EA888 engines of the second generation were especially distinguished. The design of the pistons allowed oil to freely enter the combustion chamber, which set in motion a chain reaction in the form of coke formation on the rings, and this in turn launches the problem of oil consumption in an even wider channel, grabbing the turbine at the same time. The third generation of these restyled Q3 engines after 2014 onwards. She wasted her appetites for oil through the piston, but she could not completely wash away the sins of her predecessor's problems with the chain, shafts, and high-pressure fuel pumps did not disappear anywhere. In general, a 2-liter TFSI saves only fuel, but not the wallets and nerves of motorists. Ready to pay for the dynamics of dispersal and less frequent trips to gas stations as service? If you are not ready, then it is better to take a 2-liter diesel EA288 with common rail injection. Yes, you will meet the Audi Q3 with TDI in the market infrequently, but the search is worth it. Cases with breakdowns of this engine are quite rare, unless, of course, you don't refuel at Uncle Pettia's and again change the oil more often than the cunning manufacturer orders, or rather its marketers and economists. Good news for those who once got burned and now curse DSG with dry clutches. For Audi Q3 only wet clutches. For example, 2-liter engines, regardless of the fuel consumed, work with a 7-speed S-tronic DQ500 box that can handle 600 Nm of torque without any problems. For you to understand, 320 Nm TFSI for such a box as an elephant's pellet, the resource reserve turned out to be gigantic, especially considering the low weight of the Q3. Under the condition of a timely oil change, the first signs of clutch wear appear no earlier than 200 to 250 TkM. It's a pity that no one is immune from the premature breakdown of mechatronics, which is unpredictable in its liking. There have been repairs before, but unlike dry DSGs, and even in comparison with a 2.0 gasoline engine, there are no weak points here. Yes, there are occasional misunderstandings. With a 6-speed DQ250 working only with 1.4, the story is the same. Before 200,000 kilometers, the clutch is unlikely to give up. From the very beginning, the all-wheel drive of the Audi Q3 was realized through the Haldex coupling of the 4th generation. This unit can be reliable, but this will require you to periodically change the oil and not meddle in the sands and swamps at all, since the clutches and the pump do not tolerate overheating. After restyling in 2014, Haldex 4 was replaced by the 5th generation of the clutch with more developed characteristics. The only pity is that the filter has disappeared from the hydraulic system, so all wear products safely circulate in a closed circuit and, if the 4th generation allowed you to forget about changing the oil for 50 TkM, then the 5th generation forces you to change the lubricant every 30 to 40 TkM. Otherwise, the Q3 will face the premature death of the pump or clutches, especially for those who like to drive into the wilds of the forest, for which such a purely urban crossover is simply not intended. The chassis of the Audi Q3 asks for the first repair early enough. For example, the front McPherson support bearings, due to the unhindered release of lubricant, often begin to creak and crunch even up to 50 TkM. By 100,000 kilometers, you can prepare for a more serious suspension repair. By this point, the silent blocks of the front levers usually become unusable, and the owners of the Q3 have adapted to put rubber bands from the charged version of the RS. They are tougher and more durable. Another thing is that comfort also suffers. Shock absorbers, like wheel bearings, live here for about 150 TkM, depending on the driving style and the quality of the roadway in your city. The rear suspension of the Audi Q3, or rather the silent blocks of numerous levers, retains its factory parts well for the first 200,000 kilometers, and then you need to be ready to cut the breakaway bolts, since at this point they are firmly attached. Steering problems are rare. It is worth periodically monitoring the anthers of the steering rack, otherwise the expensive assembly is waiting for the release of lubricant, corrosion, and retirement along with the electric booster under the knocks of increased backlash. Such cases happen. Chips that do not understand where they come from and multiply instantly are already familiar to VAG lovers. So the body of the Audi Q3 after 100,000 kilometers from the thresholds to the roof is covered with a scattering of bald spots, in which you can see the main culprit, galvanization. Unpleasant. But the metal does not rot and chips are only a cosmetic flaw. I greased it a little with a brush and you don't worry that in 5 years only the frame will remain from the car. There are no other problems with the body, only the electronics are slightly let down. Thus, sometimes the servo drive of the gas tank flap fails, because of which there is a risk of leaving the car without gasoline or clenching your will into a fist and breaking the cover with a screwdriver right at the gas station. The leather interior of the Audi Q3 is quite durable. After 100,000 kilometers it looks, if not new, then slightly shabby. Fabric upholstery, in principle, is also not a timid one. Its only drawback will be only a tendency to stains and water stains due to undried pants. If you are not a fan of collective farming the lot, then you should not worry about electronics either, unlike many other Audi models. A few photos of the salon from the practice of auto selection. This car has traveled 40,000 kilometers. The Q3, as a representative of compact premium crossovers, is not doing well in the used car market. You will have to look for a good option, especially if you want a version with a 1.4 TFSI engine. The main part of the cars will not be technically serviced properly. There are also a lot of broken options. A typical Audi Q3 with a mileage of 100,000 kilometers is a couple of secondary colors: oil snot from the turbine and the intake, soot under the valve cover, attachments to the chassis, multiple errors in the ECU blocks. The only good news is that almost no one has problems with the robot, and the interior is well preserved over time and mileage, which somewhat hinders the assessment of real mileage on indirect grounds. By the way, the mileage here is duplicated in numerous blocks: engine, ABS, gearbox, equipment control. True, there are also enough cool guys odometer spotters, so trust the computer, but check with your eyes. One way or another, computer diagnostics when buying such a car is required. And this should not be a banal reading of errors, but a full-fledged analysis of the data, which the Germans have more than enough. All you need is an experienced person and the right equipment. You can contact our specialists. A suitable gasoline Q3 after a conscious owner, as a rule, has to wait, because there are few of them. It is better to refuse options with a mileage of more than 130,000 kilometers, or lay a completely different budget for the nearest service and likely expensive repairs. I do not recommend taking all the systematic weaknesses that are listed here as an attempt to dissuade such a purchase. The Audi Q3 is a nice, comfortable little one, just with its cockroaches, which the engineers still can't get rid of with a filthy broom. Or they don't want to. Or marketers with economists do not give. No matter. You just need to remember that any premium car will ask you for comfort not only at the time of purchase, but also during maintenance. This is normal. You just need to properly budget and prioritize.